All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're doing our deep dive and comprehensive scouting report of Falcons second round linebacker out of Montana State, Troy Andersen. We'll be talking about the pros, the cons, and how much of a project is Troy Andersen going to be to reach his full potential, which is very high here in Atlanta.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at Falcfans, and of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And like all Locked On Sports Atlanta podcasts, you can find Locked On Falcons free and available Monday through Friday on your preferred podcast platform, whether that be Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as the video version of the podcast on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And if you're watching the video version of the podcast, you may be noticing me holding my microphone because my microphone stand broke this morning. It was a little wobbly and I tried to fix it and I wound up breaking one of the legs. And so now I have to hold my microphone. So I apologize in advance if the audio is a little wonky, because, you know, I can't necessarily always control the distance between my mouth and the microphone. And so if it goes up and down, I apologize in advance for that, particularly for you audio listeners. But let's talk all about Troy Andersen, the Falcons second round pick out of Montana State. Very talented player. We'll talk a little bit about how Andersen's kind of a project, kind of a low floor, high ceiling type of player, and sort of where I expect him and project him to sort of land along that very big spectrum in terms of his NFL outcomes and futures. But let's talk about the background, because he's a very interesting player, comes from Montana, was kind of a guy that was always, whether it was in high school or college, the best athlete on the field. In high school, he ran track. He was a state champion sprinter. He played wide receiver and safety early in his high school career. Then I believe he moved to quarterback as a junior. And that sort of background playing safety, I think, is a testament to why he's so good in coverage. We'll talk about that a little bit later as we continue today's episode. But despite this sort of, pedigree at his high school in Montana, he was a 0-star recruit, essentially based off of what I read, the recruiting websites, because no one outside the state of Montana knew who he was. He wasn't necessarily featured in a lot of these things. And no offense to Montana, but not necessarily known as a national football hotbed by any means, but certainly produces some good NFL players, and Andersen being one of those. And so he wound up going to Montana State. I read somewhere where he liked their blue collar work ethic, and do the process of doing research for this episode. I found out that this Montana State rivalry is something that's a lot more compelling than it probably is in national headlines. So something to dig into if you're ever, in that part of the country. But at Montana State, he began his career as a running back, where his position coach as a freshman was Michael Petrie, who the Falcons just hired to be their new running backs coach this past offseason. And based off of the commentary earlier this offseason and post-draft from Arthur Smith, it sounded like Petrie kind of vouched for Troy Andersen, and that was a big reason why the Falcons fell in love with him. And after a year at running back, then he moved to quarterback and assumed that starting position at the quarterback position, due to the incumbent starter being under academics suspension, and essentially explained it as he did anything he did to help out the team, and sort of buys in that team first mentality. And while I didn't go back and watch his highlights when he was playing primarily offense his first 2 years, or I didn't watch his film, I should say, I did watch some of his highlights. And based off what I saw in the highlights, at least as a quarterback, wasn't much of a highlight reel in terms of passing. It was a lot of running stuff. So in a world where he's the fourth string quarterback for the team, and all the other guys get COVID or whatever the case may be, or get food poisoning, and he's forced to start a game, I think the Falcons will be running the football quite a bit. It'll be more like the Tim Tebow offense if that is the case. But in a world where we're talking about Troy Andersen having a potential future on offense. I think that's a world where you could see Arthur Smith, if he ever gets back into his bag as a play caller, sort of looks at his old buddy Mike Vrabel and what he did in New England as a sort of a red zone tight end. I could see Troy Andersen fitting into a similar role, but that's probably several years down the road and only after he establishes himself as a linebacker. And that was something that he was able to do starting his junior year at Montana State, spent the last 2 years there playing that position. And the thing about Troy Andersen that you notice the more you read about him is basically like he succeeds at pretty much everything he does, right? In high school, he was the valedictorian, not only being the star athlete. When he was a running back at Montana State, he was the Big Sky All Conference Freshman of the Year. His second year as a quarterback, he was a third team All American, first team All Conference. Then he moves to linebacker. He's first team All Conference, first team All American. And then this past year improved to be sort of the Big Sky Defensive Player of the Year. And, you see not only, this excellence, on and off the field, but you see his skill set on the field is primarily reads his scouting work kind of reads similar to what you saw with Deion Jones, which is a high value coverage player. That's the thing that really stands out with Troy Andersen, his speed, his range, his ability to make plays sideline to sideline. Most of the plays that he's making against the run or in pass game is out in space. He has good feel for playing in space, good ability in pursuit, and whatever the case may be. He played Mike linebacker. You could see him dropping off, playing that deep middle when Montana State would deploy the sort of their Tampa 2 coverage, and that's something that the Falcons did quite a bit this past year with Dean Pease. As a player that has limited experience as a linebacker, you see a player that, recognition and being able to read his keys and those things didn't seem to be a problem in the games that I watched. And so that's a testament to sort of his intelligence and basically being that quarterback of the defense. And from some of the interviews and press conferences I read about Troy Andersen, was a guy that utilized, that time playing quarterback, and sort of the mental aspect of the game seems to sort of apply on defense. So a player that I think gives a lot of value in sort of third downs in terms of coverage ability. What was interesting reading some other scouting reports as I was doing more research on Troy Andersen was some people were knocking his coverage ability. And I'll admit that the 8 games I saw from him this past year at Montana State were all in the latter half of this past season. So maybe if there were some coverage issues that those people were sort of seeing in film, maybe that happened early in the season. So if that was the case, and maybe it's a testament that how much improvement he showed over the course of the season. But I didn't see anything where coverage to me was an issue for him. It was primarily a strength. And we know coverage has been something that the Falcons have not been lacking in at the linebacker position these last couple of years. We've known for the last 6 years that they've had really good linebackers when it comes to coverage. But the concerns for the Falcons at linebacker position has always been more in terms of those guys' ability to play against the run. And I think that's going to continue to be a concern with Troy Andersen, because when we talk about the areas where he needs to get better as a football player, it primarily is on those early down situations. His run fits. There were too often times where he was getting pancaked. He was getting moved out of the hole. He was an inconsistent tackler. I thought his tackling was a little bit better in the FCS playoffs as Montana State, and he was, instrumental in leading them to, the national title game where they got beat by North Dakota State, who's like the Alabama of FCS football. Although I'm sure many of the Georgia fans listening are saying, like, you mean the Georgia, but Georgia's beginning their dynasty. So 10 years from now, we'll call North Dakota State the Georgia of college football, after Georgia's dominated that conference. I have to say nice things about Georgia to the Georgia fans, because I'm probably not going to say nice things about Georgia, or at least a Georgia player, later when we get to Justin Schaefer on the scouting report. But the thing with Troy Andersen, he was tentative at times too often when it came to taking on contact, and that led to some of his struggles getting blown up by blocks by offensive linemen. There were times where running backs, when he was blitzing, it would be effective sort of standing him up. And the concern for that is, like, when you're playing at this lower level of competition, and, Montana State's one of the, better programs in the FCS level. So it's not as if he's playing Division III or anything like that. But like, if you're not dominating physically at the FCS level, what are you going to do at the NFL level? Right? If you're not being able to blast, FCS level offensive linemen, and several of those are NFL caliber guys, but like, what happens when the competition steps up at the next level? what happens week one, or I probably shouldn't say week one because, when he's facing guards, he'll be facing Andrews Pete and he's garbage. So he won't have a problem week one. But, later in the season, we're facing the Browns and he's having to deal with, trying to defeat blocks from Joel Batoni or Wyatt Teller, or later in the season when we play the Bucs and Shaq Mason. If he can't beat FCS level offensive linemen, you don't feel very confident that he can do that against NFL linemen. So that's an area that really needs to get better with Troy Andersen, similar to what we've seen the last couple of years with Deion Jones not struggling to make strides in that regard. And so we'll have to sort of see about that. But in terms of what my expectations for what Troy Andersen's role will be here in Atlanta, I'm expecting him to be the Mike linebacker. I'm expecting him to be groomed to be the quarterback of the defense. He'll probably play primarily special teams this year, similar to what we saw with several other rookies last year for the Falcons. And Dean Pease, I don't think it's going to be too gung-ho about rushing Troy Andersen on the football field. But starting next year, I think after a year to sort of get his feet wet and learn the scheme, you're kind of expecting him to be in the mix to be the starter at that Mike linebacker spot. And we'll see if, Rashaan Evans is retained, and we'll see what happens at the other linebacker positions elsewhere this season that will play a part in that. But certainly I think the Falcons are looking at Troy Andersen as being the guy that can be the long-term quarterback of their defense. And I think if he is playing as a rookie, I think primarily you'll probably see him in a similar role to what Michael Walker played this past year as that sort of third linebacker when they go to their 3-3-5 nickel stuff. I think Andersen can do that. And that was primarily, Walker was playing maybe 6 or 7 snaps on average most weeks. And most of those snaps, 4 or 5 of those snaps were in coverage on third downs and whatnot, primarily in that role. And I think Andersen has the ability to play that role. But beyond that, I do think his abilities in run support may have to be hidden at least early in the NFL. And I think in terms of expectations on what he can be and what he can be, particularly starting next year in year 2, you feel a lot better that he can make the jump if you also see some of these other young players this year for the Falcons from their 2021 draft class, like Richie Grant, potentially making the jump this year. And you can feel a lot better about this coaching staff's ability to develop a player like Andersen, who does have a lot of areas of his game that need to improve. And we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. We'll talk a little bit more about sort of how Andersen kind of is like a, the tale of two Troy Andersens, where like there's a player that you look at and you're like, well, I don't know about this. But then there's a player that happened in that national championship game that really sort of stood out at a certain point in that national championship game. And we're like, if we can get more of that guy, like that guy has a chance to be special. And we'll go deeper into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons scouting report of Troy Andersen. But before we get there, guys, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed, where you can find 3 different shows giving you 3 different perspectives or 4 different perspectives on all of Atlanta, Georgia sports, as well as national headline making news. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, and of course ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanisha Batiste. Jarvis will be joining us on a future episode of Locked On Falcons later this week, and you get his perspective there. But if you want to get Jarvis's and Tanisha, as well as Mark and John's perspective every single day, make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast feed on your preferred podcast platform, all the same ones that you check out Locked On Falcons. And of course, if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you will also get the Atlanta Braves post-game, post-cast reactions there as well. And guys, I want to tell you about a product called Athletic Greens, or a product made by Athletic Greens called AG1 that I've started to use every day. It's basically like taking a multivitamin without having to take a ton of many millions of different pills. All you just need is 1 scoop of AG1 with a cup of water first thing in the morning, and my day starts off right. And in AG1, their product contains 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, superfoods, probiotics, adaptogens. It's a special blend of ingredients that helps improve my gut health, my nervous system, boost my immune system, boost my energy, recovery, my focus throughout the day. And then you too can reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition with AG1. And all you have to do is head on over to the website, athleticgreens.com/NFL network, and Athletic Greens to sweeten the pot. And their offer is going to give you a free year-long supply of immune-supporting vitamin D, and as well as 5 free travel packs of AG1 with your first purchase. So you can always take your AG1 when you're on the go. Just visit athleticgreens.com/NFL network. That's athleticgreens.com/NFL network to take ownership of your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. So when we're talking about Troy Andersen, as I mentioned, he's a project. He's kind of a boom bust guy. And you're betting on, and the Falcons are making this bet. They're betting on the ability that they're going to be able to develop, some of the things that aren't quite there. And one of the things I've learned over 20 years of being wrong about a lot of college prospects and evaluating college prospects, I try to learn from these things, is that development at the NFL level, most often, there's exceptions to this, but most often, the overwhelming majority of the time is about refining the player that you already are, not necessarily teaching you new skills. And I think that's going to be a concern for Troy Andersen because, if he doesn't get significantly better against the run, if they're refining what he is, that's going to be a player that's going to be more often than not a liability against the run, right? You can refine the coverage stuff, but as we've learned with Deion Jones, that only goes so far, right? Like when Deion Jones and several of these other Falcons linebackers that they've had over the years have been at their best when they can play a lot more coverage, when they've been coupled with high-powered offensive attacks, right? Deion Jones, started his career very strong in 2016, 2017, 2018 when he was healthy because the Falcons could put points on the board and they could get leads and force other teams to abandon their running game in the second half of the game. So you wouldn't see Deion Jones getting, mashed into the dirt consistently in the second halves of the games, and that was effective. But then the minute the Falcons stopped having that type of high-powered offense, Deion Jones's abilities started to be a little bit more problematic, and that's my main concern with Troy Andersen. And what was interesting was one of the things I saw in that national championship game against North Dakota State. They kind of mashed, Montana State early in that game, got off to a 28 halftime lead, and a big part of that was Troy Andersen really struggling in the first half of that game. And there had been ups and downs with Troy Andersen's film up to that point, and it kind of really culminated going up against that high-powered North Dakota State relative again to FCS program, again the Georgia/Alabama of the next level down of football. And there were times where he was getting mashed, he was getting finished, he was getting ran right at I think 3 out of the 4 North Dakota State rushing touchdowns. He was kind of key blocked on those plays. It was his a fullback, a guard here sort of sealing him off that led to some of those big gains. And then something kind of changed at halftime for Troy Andersen. It was a really rough first half. And then, I think like it was the first play, he kind of got finished by an offensive lineman. We talked about finishing last year when we talked about Jalen Mayfield, and, you want to be able to finish guys, and that really gets under the skin. And it seemed like it got under the skin of Troy Andersen because after that point, like he was like, never again. Like, and his demeanor, his play, his physicality for the rest of the game was very good. He was much better against his run fits. He was much more physical. He was, getting after it with the offensive lineman and, giving more than he was being given in those points in time. And so I don't know if Montana State's coaches said something to him, lit a fire under him at halftime because they were, their manhood was being checked or whatever the case may be. But the player that came out in the second half against North Dakota State, even in a non-winnable game, is more the player like, oh, that player is intriguing because that's a player that, coupled with his coverage abilities, that's a player that wasn't a liability against the run. And so when I look at that, I say, okay, like that's something that I can get excited about and be high on his potential if that type of player shows out, consistently, daily and weekly in the NFL. But here's my problem. I watched 8 games of his this past year, and essentially the first 7.5 games, his physicality was very questionable. And so you're looking at 32 quarters of football, and 2 quarters say, oh, this guy has more than enough physicality to be effective in the NFL level. And then 30 quarters of, very inconsistent and questioning. And then sort of that's basically a 94 to 6% split, right? And so how do I evaluate that? Like generally my rule of thumb is like, I look at the overall body of work, and if 94% of the tape is telling me this guy's going to be very inconsistent at best against the run, if not, at times an outright liability, and 6% of the film says, oh no, that's going to be a non-issue. How do I evaluate that? And my general rule of thumb is I'm going to lean more towards the 94% than the 6%. But obviously, other people may have a different perspective. The Falcons may have a different perspective, particularly that they have some insight into Troy Andersen's mentality, and they know that the player that he was in the second half of that NDSU game is more the player that he can be every single day moving forward. So that's going to be interesting to sort of monitor with Troy Andersen's development. What I will sit here and say is if the Falcons do want that 6% player to be more of the guy that shows up each and every day, they have to do a better job of surrounding him with talent. And I think that starts with having a nose tackle that can keep him clean. I know that's a issue that a lot of folks believe that Deion Jones needed to have success in the NFL. And regardless of where you land on that particular subject, I think certainly the Falcons will be doing a disservice to Troy Andersen if they're expecting, again, 94% chance that that player does not show up that can handle all those sort of, dealing with the trash and traffic of dealing with offensive line blocks and all that various thing. Give him a high level nose tackle, and that will become less of an issue for him. And so therefore you can potentially do a better job betting on the 6% chance that he winds up, doing better at that point in time. So that's kind of where I kind of land on sort of the tale of two Troy Andersons. Which player are you getting, the second half NDSU guy or the first half NDSU guy, which was a little bit more inconsistent. And that's going to be part of my methodology when I sort of try to project what he can be when we talk about his floor, his ceiling, and his eye level, to give you some NFL comparisons for where I think Troy Andersen will land. As I said earlier, I do think he's kind of a boom bust guy. So his floor is probably going to be a little bit lower than maybe some people would like to hear. His ceiling may be a little bit higher than some people think. And sort of the interesting thing is going to be trying to find that sort of halfway sweet spot as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I do want to tell you about the Locked On Sports Today podcast hosted by Peter Bukowski, who's giving you all the daily news, the biggest stories from around the sports landscape, each and every day in less than 20 minutes on your preferred podcast feed. So subscribe to Locked On Sports Today on, Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, or on YouTube. And guys, I want to tell you about baseball being back, the NBA playoffs being back. You got NHL playoffs as well, golf, and so many sports that if you're, feeling like you want to get a little bit more cash in your pocket, this summer, as you want to sit here and you have strong opinions about the outcomes this upcoming NFL season, you can do so. And the way that you do so is heading on over to betonline.net, the number one source for all your sports betting needs and info. You can find the latest odds, contests, and player props. If you want to bet on Marcus Mariota being the comeback player of the year, you can bet on that. You can bet on the Falcons win totals over and under. You can bet on NBA playoff games, NHL playoff games, baseball, UFC, golf, hockey, horse racing, esports, your favorite Vegas casino games. Find it all at betonline.net. Head to the website today. Use your mobile device to sign up to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So as a reminder of my methodology when I do these floor, ceiling, eye level comparisons, my floor is what I expect a player to be coming into the NFL year one. And, I've gotten some feedback, particularly with Drake London, and being like, you're too low on some of these guys. But a lot of that is due to my expectation and understanding that like 90% of rookies are backup caliber NFL players right away in the NFL. I sit here similar to the 94-6 question with Troy Andersen and his outcomes, 90-10. What are the odds that you're going to get the 10% guy that's going to come in and really light the league on fire right away? And like for, really, really talented players like Kyle Pitts, I will much more veer towards that 10% outcome. But for most of the other ones, I'm going to keep it relatively low at the 90% level. Now, obviously, in contrast to that, the ceiling is, to me, where I sort of see the player's maximum potential should he be able to fully develop in the future, sort of the best case outcome for that player. And the eye level, to me, is kind of the halfway point between the floor and the ceiling, which is where sort of the sweet spot where the player is likely to wind up with some development, but may not necessarily get the max development. And so, as I said earlier, Anderson's a little bit of a boom bust player, a low floor, high ceiling type of player. And sort of starting with my floor for him, I have a former Falcon, but I do want to mention a player that was drafted in the third round in 2021 that was also a former quarterback turned linebacker in UNC's Chaz Surratt, who was picked up by the Vikings. And, I think Anderson's probably going to do more than this coming into the league, but it's notable that Chaz Surratt was basically a special teams player and kind of barely saw the field as special teams player with the Vikings in year one. And so that's, based off of some of the recent episodes I've listened to with Locked On Vikings, it sounds like he might be on the roster bubble as early as going into year two. And sort of like, again, these outcomes aren't necessarily great, but in terms of my floor comp for Troy Andersen, I think he'll come in better than what Chaz Surratt did. And we won't be talking about him being on the roster bubble, a year from now. But my comp for him was Paul Warlow. And, I know some people probably just swerved off the road as they heard that name, and I think people forget that, like, Paul Warlow had a quite a large hype train back in 2013, 2014 when he first came to Atlanta. He was a very good athlete coming out of Delaware, again, an FCS program, which was a powerhouse at that time, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember him having one of the best preseasons I've ever seen an undrafted free agent have for the Falcons back in 2013. But obviously that did not translate to Paul Warlow being an impactful starter in the league. He obviously got those opportunities, but I think ultimately we kind of look at Paul Warlow as a high caliber backup, a very low level starter, and sort of, the images that have burned into my brain with Paul Warlow and his limitations in the NFL is that 2014 game against the Vikings where Jerick McKinnon and Matt Asiata ran it down the Falcons' throat, and a lot of that was due to, Jerome Felton, blasting and mashing Paul Warlow into the dirt in that game. He just didn't have the physicality to be an effective player. And again, in that first half of that NDSU game, that's kind of how, Troy Andersen was looking. And so you do wonder, again, that 94-6 split, it's like that might be what Troy Andersen is going to be coming into the league. But, to Paul Warlow's credit, he's a high character guy, great locker room guy. I was very critical of Paul Warlow back in the day. I still will call him PJ, standing for pile jumper, for eternity, because it's just a great nickname. And I think sometimes I think myself pretty clever. I'm sure many of you don't agree with that, but you go check out his episode that he did with the Falcoholic Live earlier this offseason. And he's a great guy, and I've matured since then. Again, I'll still call him PJ, but I appreciate the player a lot more and the person that Paul Warlow is now more nowadays than I did back then. And now I'm just kind of like, my frustration retroactively is more at the coaching staff for trying to sell us Paul Warlow for 3 years, when he just didn't have it, more so than being mad at the player. And I think that's kind of my minimum expectation for sort of Troy Andersen and what he can be in the NFL day one, be that type of player, but may struggle with some of the aspects of the physical nature of the position moving forward. But when I look at the sort of best outcome for Troy Andersen, I was trying to look at players that were high caliber linebackers, that are great athletes, very instinctual, but may not necessarily be known as the most physical linebackers out there. And kind of the best version I could sort of find was a player like Fred Warner, who's kind of the quarterback of the 49ers defense, is integral to their success, a 3-down impactful player, unique abilities in coverage, but also is a solid run defender. But you wouldn't necessarily look at him, in the same lens as like a Bobby Wagner when it comes to that sort of physicality of being that force in the middle of the defense. And I think that's kind of the best version of what Troy Andersen can be. Now, obviously, Fred Warner, where people sort of put him as a NFL linebacker right now, I think most people would probably rank him in the top 3 linebackers in the NFL. He certainly paid the second highest paid linebacker in the NFL and was the highest paid linebacker in the NFL for at least a month last summer before Darius Leonard signed his contract extension. And I wouldn't sit here and expect Troy Andersen to be a top 3 linebacker when we're having this conversation of who's the best off-ball linebacker in the league, 4 or 5 years down the road, like we're having with Fred Warner at this point in his career. So if like Fred Warner's in the top 3 consensus off-ball linebackers, if you're asking me, to project what Troy Andersen can be in terms of linebacker rankings 5 years from now, I would guess that he could be a top 10 guy, but probably not a top 3 guy. Like he'll be 7, 8, 9 in that sort of range in terms of ranking linebackers. And that's a guy that can be the quarterback of your defense, but unlike Fred Warner, I don't know if he's going to be sort of the critical component of your defense. Obviously, the 49ers defense is known more for their pass rush, but Fred Warner is a key part of why that defense has been so good the last couple of years. And so when I think about kind of another former Falcon, to sort of piggyback on the Paul Warlow thing about where I think Andersen could be, is kind of like Keith Brooking. Now, Keith Brooking has a complicated legacy kind of in Atlanta because he was kind of the face of the Falcons defense for many, many years. And certainly I think towards the end of his career was getting accolades that weren't quite deserving. He wound up making 5 consecutive Pro Bowls from 2001 to 2005. And I think that was back in the day where, fan voting was heavily influenced by just looking at tackle numbers. And once Keith Brooking sort of established himself as a guy, sort of getting that name recognition, was just kind of repeatedly, people were just like, oh yeah, put Keith Brooking in the Pro Bowl every single year, even though probably for most of those last 5 years that he was in Atlanta, you could probably point to him being the second best linebacker on the team behind guys like Chris Draft and Michael Boley. But when I think about sort of Brooking's sort of peak, Keith Brooking in sort of early in that phase right after kind of Jesse Tuggle left, sort of 3-4 years into his NFL career. That's a Keith Brooking that I thought was a really good player, and him and Troy Andersen are kind of similar in that regard. Good speed, good instincts, not necessarily like super physical, not strikers in the way that Jesse Tuggle was or other Falcon linebackers have been, but just guys that do their job and really play high end football and can be leaders and all these various things. And so it goes back to the conversation we had earlier when if Troy Anderson is going to reach his potential, I think he's going to be a cog in the machine rather than sort of the engine that makes the defense go, so to speak, in terms of his high level. And if you put the right pieces around him, a nose tackle, you put another inside linebacker next to him that can be more of that downhill hammer in the run game to sort of supplement him being more, I guess you can call it finesse. Then I think Troy Andersen could be, maximized in the right defense if he's surrounded by the right pieces. But I don't know if he's going to be like, you look at a player like Fred Warner as the guy that makes that thing go. And so when it comes to trying to find a midpoint for Troy Andersen, I struggled with this because there were two players that kind of came to mind for me. One was Cole Holcomb, the middle linebacker for Washington. The other one was Blake Martinez, the middle linebacker for Green Bay. And both of these guys are kind of similar to me. Both of these guys were day 3 selections, Holcomb being a 5th round pick, Martinez being a 4th round pick with the Packers back in 2016. And, like Holcomb's probably the better athlete between these two guys, but Martinez, in terms of his career, when you look back at like the 6-7 years he's played in the NFL, is kind of what I'm expecting to be a realistic outcome for Troy Andersen. It's funny because we just talked about Cole Holcomb a little bit earlier this week when we talked about possible destinations for Deion Jones to be traded to, and Washington liking Holcomb as sort of that smart quarterback of their defense that can lock down, one of the starting spots, but he's never going to be a guy that you're going to look at and say, yeah, that guy's a stud, and you're never going to be committed to him, right? And we saw that kind of with the Packers, where Blake Martinez was a very effective and productive starter for them for 4 years, but wasn't quite enough to earn a second contract with him. And now as the Giants, as the leader, Andersen is a much better athlete than Martinez was, but that type of guy that, I imagine both Holcomb and Martinez will wind up having this type of career. They play a decade in the NFL. They wind up starting 7 or 8 years in the NFL. Most people will look back at them and say solid. The good outweighs the bad, but they're kind of up and down. Coaches are going to love them. They're going to do their job, that sort of thing. They're not going to be out of position, but you do wonder a little bit with the limitations that they bring to the table. Maybe Holcomb, that's size, Martinez, that's athleticism and coverage ability, and Andersen, you do kind of wonder, it's not going to be a size issue, it's not going to be a coverage issue, but just a physicality standpoint, if he's going to get, pushed around a little bit more at the NFL level. And so that's why I can't necessarily be super high on projecting, Andersen in terms of his eye level. Again, I think that's a guy that's probably like a 6 out of 10 starter, a solid, slightly above average starter. But I certainly think Andersen has the potential to be more than that, clearly, with, sort of comparing him to Fred Warner. And it's just going to be a question of whether or not Falcons can get that type of ability out of him. And we'll just sort of have to see. I tend to be a lot more skeptical. I tend to be more in wait and see mode. And certainly if some of the more raw players that the Falcons had drafted a year ago had hit the ground running immediately in the NFL, I would feel a lot better about this coaching staff's ability to develop players. Not to sit here and say that they can't develop players. We just haven't seen it yet. Like the one player that was successful, coming from that 2021 draft class was, Kyle Pitts. And of course, Kyle Pitts is just a rare, beautiful, unicorn, elegant with, that flowing mane and whatnot. And so it's like, yeah, that guy, this guy that was a generational tight end prospect, one of the best tight end prospects we've seen in 20 plus years. Oh, that guy was successful. Like, how much credit are you going to give the coaching staff? And then again, you kind of ask yourself, like, was there a little bit meat left on the bone with Kyle Pitts? Could he have been better as a rookie? Like, he was great, but like, it felt like he could have done more. And so that's why I sit here as sort of more of a skeptic than other folks. And if you buy into this coaching staff's ability to develop these players, by all means do so. I'm not going to sit here and try to dissuade you of that. I haven't seen it yet. And I'm a person that believes in the things I see rather than sort of hoping and dreaming of what I want to see happen. So I think this coaching staff will have their work cut out for Troy Andersen, but I think he certainly is going to check a lot of the boxes. And if you essentially, it's a conversation of buying into the intangibles with Troy Andersen. Going back to the earlier conversation we had, this is a guy that's been successful at everything he's put his mind to, based off of what little research I've done on him. And so you imagine he could do the same thing at the NFL level. It's just going to be if the Falcons can be able to get that out of him. And again, if you think they can, then I'm not going to sit here and argue against you. But we'll just sort of have to see. It's about making good bets versus bad bets. And traditionally, I would sit here and be like, this is not a bet that I would love to make with Troy Andersen. For me, that's just my personal preference. Maybe there were some other linebackers in the draft that I felt like maybe had a little bit higher floors. But the Falcons are making this bet, and we'll just sort of see how it all plays out. And I probably have some additional thoughts on Troy Andersen, and particularly when he compares to Deion Jones, but I'll probably save those for tomorrow's episode, where we'll be joined by Jarvis Davis of the ATL Day Ones podcast, talk a little bit more about OTAs, talk about potential Deion Jones's future, because I know Jarvis has thoughts on that. Maybe we'll pick his brain a little bit further on Troy Andersen, and now that we've had a couple more weeks to sort of think about it post draft. So that's on deck for tomorrow's episode, guys. I appreciate you for tuning in another episode of Locked On Falcons, another scouting report. Our next one should be, at least tentatively, we're planning on Sunday night with Desmond Ridder, Monday morning on the audio podcast platforms. If you want to provide your feedback, if you agree, disagree, you like the player comparisons, you hate the player comparisons, you think he's better than Deion Jones, you think he's worse than Deion Jones, whatever you think, I'm more than welcome to hearing your feedback on that. You can leave a comment here on YouTube. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can hit me up on social media at Locked On Falcons on either Twitter or Facebook. So, guys, that is going to do it for us. Hopefully, I will have this mic stand fixed later this week, and hopefully you didn't get ruined by this audio experience on this one. And that's going to do it for us, guys. And last thing I'll say, and this news kind of was breaking as I was recording. There was another school shooting at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, at Robb Elementary, and at least based off of the initial reports, 15 people were killed. And thoughts and prayers to all the people and the families out there. It's just unfathomable to imagine, taking your kids to school. And I'm sure many of you guys are listening to this as you're taking your kids to schools, and the thought process of the idea that you may be saying goodbye and kissing your kids goodbye for the last time. Like, I can't imagine having that thought process as some of you guys may be experienced today as you're listening to this episode. And so, I want everybody to stay safe out there, but people wonder, like, we don't get political on this podcast, but like, people wonder, like, why are you pessimistic? And it's like, I just don't have faith in humanity. And it's like, 10 years ago, we had the Sandy Hook shooting and nothing changed. And, a couple of years ago, we had the Parkland shooting and nothing changed. We've had so many mass shootings in recent years or recent days here in America, and nothing changes. And it's just hard to feel, optimistic about things where, like, we let these things happen in this country. Is the old Onion joke is like, what is it like, the only nation where this happens says this is how do we prevent this from happening in the only nation where this stuff happens. So hopefully, this we'll sit here and say never again with this stuff, and there will be real sweeping change. But history kind of tells you that nothing will get done for this stuff, and we'll go on living back normal lives. And this will just be something that we live with, on a day-to-day basis. I remember watching, Doctor Strange movie a couple of weeks ago in the movie theaters, and looking around the movie theater and having to sort of plan an exit strategy, and being like, if someone came in here and started shooting up this movie theater, could I hide behind that sort of thing? Is that barrier bulletproof? And it's terrible that I have to live in a country, and then you guys have to live in a country where that's a daily thought that you have to think about when you go to a public place. Is some person going to decide, that they're, with easy access to guns, is going to be like, I'm going to go out and shoot over a dozen people, or whatever the case may be. And there's too many instances where that happens. So, sitting here and talking football, that's what I do. And, I don't have the answers to these questions, but, something has to be said about this stuff, and something has to be done about this stuff. And so hopefully, if you're sitting here being like, why is Aaron so pessimistic, in life or whatever the case may be, it's because like I have to put my faith in humanity, and stuff like this happens, and it makes it really hard to do that, especially when you have people out there in the world that are purposely have no interest in stopping tragedies like the ones we've experienced in this country these last couple of weeks from happening ever again. So that's my thoughts on it. I'm done talking about non-football stuff. And I would say, if you feel compelled to respond to that in the comments or whatever the case may be, I talked about it, so I'm not going to sit here and stop anybody else talking about it. But I would say try your best to be sensitive and understanding on other people's perspectives, regardless of sort of where you stand on the Second Amendment or whatever the case may be in this country. So that's what I will say. That's where I'll leave it, guys. Appreciate it. Sorry for taking you on this rant, I guess, at the end of the episode, but that'll do it for us here today. Appreciate it. Stay safe out there. Until then.